You know that moment when everyone else seems to be talking at once. And you're there listening, not zoning out, not disconnected, just taking it in. You notice the shifts in tone, the subtle tension when someone interrupts someone else, the pause before a joke lands. You think of something to say, maybe even something thoughtful, but by the time there's space, the conversation has already moved on. And somehow, you leave the room feeling like you were present, but unseen. There's a certain kind of person who often finds themselves in that position. Not because they have nothing to say, not because they're unsure of themselves, but because their mind doesn't move in the same rhythm as the room. Society tends to have a quick explanation for this. Quiet equals shy, or insecure, or socially anxious, sometimes even arrogant or uninterested. But most of the time, that interpretation misses something important. When someone stays quiet in a group, it's rarely about a lack of depth. Often, it's about depth moving inward instead of outward. The psychology of people who stay quiet in groups is more layered than it looks. There's more going on here than people realize. Research on temperament and personality has long shown that some nervous systems are more sensitive to stimulation. Psychologist Elaine Aron described this trait as high sensitivity. But even outside that framework, neuroscience supports the idea that certain brains process social information more intensely. Brain imaging studies suggest that more reflective individuals show increased activity in areas related to internal processing, regions connected to memory, meaning-making, and emotional nuance. In simple terms, while others are reacting in real time, you might be integrating. Group settings are fast. They reward quick responses, confident interruptions, and surface-level spontaneity. But if your brain is wired to observe patterns, track emotional undercurrents, and think before speaking, silence can become the natural outcome. Not because you're frozen, but because you're processing. There's also the nervous system component. Some people grew up in environments where speaking freely didn't always feel safe. Maybe conversations were dominated by louder personalities. Maybe being outspoken led to criticism, dismissal, or subtle consequences. Over time, the body adapts. It learns that listening is safer than competing. That restraint can become automatic. Not as fear necessarily, but as calibration. The nervous system becomes highly attuned to dynamics. It scans before it acts. It weighs impact before expression. And after years of repetition, this pattern doesn't feel like strategy anymore. It just feels like who you are. But this isn't a flaw. It's an adaptation. And it isn't better or worse than being the person who fills the room with energy. Different nervous systems developed for different environments. Some are built to initiate and externalize. Others are built to absorb and interpret. Groups tend to spotlight the first type. They rarely notice the second. There's also something counterintuitive here. Many quiet people in groups are not lacking confidence. In fact, some of them are deeply self-aware. They know exactly what they could say. They simply don't feel compelled to say it unless it adds something meaningful. In a culture that equates visibility with value, choosing not to compete for airtime can look like absence. But internally, there is often a steady presence. At the same time, there is a quiet cost. When you consistently take the role of observer, people may assume you don't have strong opinions. They may overlook your complexity. Over time, you might even start underestimating how much space you're allowed to take up. Not because you can't speak, but because you've practiced not needing to. The paradox is this: the same capacity that allows you to read the room so well can also make you hyper-aware of disrupting it. You feel shifts that others miss. You sense when someone is uncomfortable. You notice when attention subtly turns. That sensitivity is a strength. It creates empathy, depth, and often emotional intelligence. But it can also make self-expression feel heavier than it does for others. None of this means you're broken. It means your system learned to prioritize awareness over volume. And in many contexts, that's powerful. Quiet people often build one-on-one connections that are unusually deep. They remember details others forget. They see contradictions others ignore. They think in layers. In a world that moves fast and talks louder and louder, there is something steady about the person who pauses, the person who considers, the person who doesn't speak just to be heard, but speaks when it matters. If you recognize yourself in this, there's nothing wrong with the way you move through groups. It makes sense. Your experience makes sense. The way your mind works makes sense. And it may be that your quietness isn't an absence of personality. It's a different form of presence. There are other patterns like this, other traits that have been mislabeled, misunderstood, or quietly carried without explanation. If this felt familiar, there's more beneath the surface worth exploring.